Ancient Egypt and Kush were neighboring realms linked by the life-giving Nile River. To the Egyptians, Nubia, the region of Kush, was known as Tasseti, land of the bow, for its skilled archers. It was also famed as a land of wealth. The very word Nubia may derive from the Egyptian word for gold. Indeed, Nubia's riches were legendary. Tomb art from Egypt's New Kingdom shows Nubian envoys presenting tribute of ebony logs, elephant tusks, leopard skins, ostrich feathers, gold ingots, and even exotic animals. This bounty made Nubia both a valued trade partner and a target for Egyptian expansion. Geographically, the Nile flows north through Nubia into Egypt, but a series of impassable cataracts, rocky rapids, naturally divided the two lands. Over these rapids, boats could not easily sail, making the first cataract near Aswan a traditional border. Beyond that lay Nubia's ancient kingdoms. One of the earliest was the Kingdom of Kerma in Upper Nubia, a powerful state as old as Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Egyptians and Kerma Nubians had a long history of trade and warfare. At times, Kerma's influence pushed north during Egypt's weakness, even allying with the Hyksos in the Second Intermediate Period. But when Egypt's fortunes rose, pharaohs turned southward with armies to secure their resource-rich neighbor. Pharaohs and conquests. Egypt dominates Nubia by the 16th century BCE. Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs launched full-scale invasions of Nubia. The armies of Pharaoh Thutmose I, for example, penetrated deep into Kushite lands, boasting of victories as far south as the Fourth Cataract of the Nile. In a brutal assertion of dominance, Egyptian inscriptions describe how the wretched Nubian king's body was hung from the prow of the pharaoh's ship as a trophy, a stark message to all of Kush. Around 1504 to 1500 BCE, Egypt crushed the kingdom of Kerma. The major power in Nubia, victorious pharaohs, established a firm colonial rule. Nubia was absorbed into the Egyptian empire from the First to Fourth Cataracts. They set up fortified towns and temples, garrisoned soldiers, and appointed a viceroy of Kush, often called the king's son of Kush, to govern Nubia on the pharaoh's behalf. Egyptian control brought profound changes. The pharaohs eagerly tapped Nubia's riches, especially gold from its mines, and integrated the land into their economy. A remarkable scene from the tomb of Vizier Rekhmire, c. 1450 BCE, shows Nubian tribute being recorded. Ebony, ivory, leopard skins, ostrich feathers, gold rings, semi-precious stones, and even a baboon are catalogued as part of the tribute of Kush, heading north. Politically, Nubia became an Egyptian province for the next 400 years. Culturally, Egyptian influence took root along the Nile. Temples to Egyptian gods rose on Nubian soil, the temple of Amun at Gebel Barkal, near Napata, being a prime example. To legitimize their foreign rule, pharaohs cleverly blended Egyptian and Nubian religious concepts. One historical analysis suggests the conquering Egyptians identified a local Nubian god of mountain Jebel Barkal with their own supreme deity Amun, essentially merging the two. They even held coronation rituals at Jebel Barkal's base, believing the sacred mountain to be the southern throne of Amun and a source of kingship. In effect, Egyptian pharaohs adopted Nubian sacred geography to proclaim themselves rightful kings of both Egypt and Kush. This cultural fusion laid groundwork that would echo centuries later, when roles reversed and Kushite kings invoked the same god Amun to justify ruling Egypt. Yet even under Egyptian rule, Nubia's identity endured. Native elites served in the administration. Nubian soldiers, especially the famed archers, enlisted in Egypt's army. Over generations, a hybrid society emerged in Nubia, speaking Egyptian in official life and worshipping Egyptian gods, but with local customs and people still proudly Nubian. This was not a static conquest. It was an evolving interaction, setting the stage for Nubia's own rise once Egypt's grip weakened. The rise of Kush, a new power in the South Egypt's New Kingdom, eventually declined in the 11th century BCE, collapsing into internal turmoil and losing its colonies. As Egyptian authority retreated, Nubia was no passive backwater. The people of Kush, as Nubia was now often called, filled the power vacuum. By around the 10th–9th century BCE, a strong Kushite kingdom coalesced, centered at Napata, near the old holy site of Gebel Barkal. The kings of Kush saw themselves not as upstart warlords, but as heirs to the pharaohs, guardians of Egyptian tradition as well as Nubian heritage. For generations, Kushite rulers strengthened their domain along the Nile from the Third Cataract southward. They rebuilt temples, patronized the cult of Amun at Napata, and likely maintained many Egyptian-inspired practices. Importantly, they also nurtured genuine Nubian traditions, creating a distinct Nubian monarchy that nevertheless revered the memory of Egypt's grandeur. One by one, the Kushite kings, Alara, Kashta, and others, extended their influence north into what is today southern Egypt. They diplomatically and militarily gained control of Upper Egypt's city of Thebes, the religious heartland of Amun. In fact, King Kashta managed to have his daughter Amenirtis adopted as the god's wife of Amun in Thebes, effectively placing a Kushite princess in one of Egypt's most powerful religious offices. Through such shrewd moves, the Nubian kingdom positioned itself as the protector of Egypt's faith and order at a time when Egypt was fragmented among rival local dynasts. By the mid-8th century BCE, Egypt was in disarray, divided among Delta princes and Libyan warlords fighting for supremacy. It was a time ripe for outside intervention. The king of Kush at this moment was Pianki, also known as Pi, a charismatic and pious ruler. Pianki felt called to act, perhaps by the entreaties of allies in Upper Egypt, or by his devotion to Amun, compelling him to restore Ma'at, order, in Egypt. In Pianki's view, the petty kings of Egypt had defiled the land with constant warfare and neglect of the gods. The Amun priesthood in Thebes may have supported Kushite intervention as well. So Pianki marched north, leading his Nubian army into the land of the Pharaohs, determined to reunite the two lands under his rule. Kush conquers Egypt. The 25th dynasty begins around 728 BCE. Pianki launched his campaign to conquer Egypt, a remarkable turning of tables. An ancient stela, inscribed stone, from Pianki's reign vividly records this expedition. At that time, the Nile Delta in Lower Egypt was ruled by assorted princes, many of Libyan descent, who had formed a coalition to resist the encroaching Kushites. They included leaders like Tefnakht of Sais and other local chiefs, all wary of Pianki's growing influence in Thebes. When these Delta lords besieged Pianki's ally in Hermopolis, the Kushite king sent his generals north to intervene. The first attempts by his commanders failed to break the siege. Upon hearing this, Pianki, a warrior as well as a devout king, decided that only his personal leadership would turn the tide. Pi swept into Egypt with determination. According to his victory stela, he fought his way north and eventually laid siege to Memphis, Egypt's venerable capital near modern Cairo. The Delta coalition crumbled before him. One by one, the local kings submitted. The stela famously depicts those Delta rulers kneeling, noses to the ground, before Pianki's throne, offering him the crowns of Egypt. In a gesture symbolic of reconciling two nations, Pianki did not slaughter his defeated rivals. Instead, he spared them after they swore oaths of loyalty. He then went to the great temple of Amun at Karnak in Thebes to be consecrated, presenting himself as the divine son of Amun who had restored order, having achieved in a single campaign what no Nubian before him had, the unification of Egypt and Kush under one rule. Pianki did something intriguing. He returned to Kush. He had no desire to permanently relocate his court to the Delta. He had proven his supremacy and fulfilled his religious duty. Now he left Egypt in the hands of trusted vassals, including some of the very princes he defeated, and went home to Napata. Pianki's conquest, circa 720s BCE, marks the start of Egypt's 25th dynasty, a line of Kushite pharaohs. These kings from Kush would rule Egypt for roughly a century, heralding a renaissance of power and drawing the attention of the larger world. With Pianki's victory, the Kushan royal family became pharaohs of Egypt, earning the moniker Black Pharaohs in modern literature. They ruled an empire stretching from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean, breathing new life into a declining Egypt. Pianki's brother Shabaka succeeded him and officially took the throne in Egypt. Likely around 707 BCE, Shabaka moved the dynasty's seat to Memphis and consolidated Kushite control. He is remembered for restoring temples and monuments, for instance. Shabaka renovated the great temple of Karnak and reportedly built a new entrance at Luxor. He patronized literature as well, preserving ancient Egyptian wisdom texts. The famous Shabaka stone is an artifact recording old religious teachings. Diplomatically, Shabaka engaged with the wider world. Records hint at correspondence with Assyrian king Sennacherib, suggesting a desire to maintain peace or alliances as new superpowers loomed. Shabaka's successors Shebetku, Shabataka, and then Taharka continued this legacy. Pharaoh Taharka, who took the throne in 690 BCE, is the most renowned of the Kushite rulers. His reign was the pinnacle of the 25th dynasty's prosperity and ambition. Taharka styled himself as a classic Egyptian pharaoh and great builder. In Thebes, he erected colossal columns and statues. At Karnak, he added a tall shrine, the kiosk of Taharka, and a sacred lake. He also built or expanded temples in Nubia, reinforcing Amun's worship at Napata. Under Taharka, Egyptian culture experienced a revival. Art and architecture often deliberately harkened back to the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom styles, a deliberate archaism to link this Nubian dynasty with Egypt's golden age. Royal imagery blended Egyptian and Nubian elements. For example, statues of the Kushite queens, who held the powerful title God's Wife of Amin in Thebes, were made in an older Egyptian style of dress and pose, yet they had distinct Nubian facial features. The pharaohs themselves adopted unique regalia. They wore the double uraeus, two cobra emblems on their crowns, instead of the traditional single cobra of earlier Egyptian kings, a bold statement that they ruled both Upper Egypt and Kush. Culturally, Egypt and Kush were now deeply intertwined. The Kushite pharaohs honored Egyptian gods and customs, but also brought African influences into the mix. In their courts at Memphis and Thebes, one could see a melding of fashions and art. Egyptian-style faience amulets and statues, alongside Nubian styles of jewelry and pottery. In fact, archaeological finds from Kushite royal tombs show this blend vividly. At El Koru and Nuri, the royal cemeteries in Nubia for 25th dynasty and later kings, excavators found objects that mix Egyptian form with Nubian flavor. For example, vessels shaped like Egyptian ritual jars were decorated with distinctly Nubian patterns, and shabji figurines, the small servant statues for the afterlife, bore Egyptian hieroglyphs but Nubian artistic touches. This mingling of cultures at the elite level was a hallmark of the 25th dynasty. Nubian and Egyptian traditions joined in a unique synthesis. Politically, Taharka's Egypt was stable internally and even influential abroad. The dynasty's control extended from Napata to the Nile Delta, and they engaged in the geopolitics of the Near East. Taharka is even mentioned in the Bible under the name Tirhaka, king of Ethiopia, as a savior figure who came to aid the kingdom of Judah against Assyrian invasion. This reference corresponds to an episode around 701 BCE, when an Egyptian Kushite force, possibly led by a young Taharka or an ally, confronted Assyrian king Sennacherib's army near Jerusalem, helping frustrate the Assyrian assault. To later generations, this cemented Taharka's image as a mighty ruler, one of the few who dared stand against Assyria's juggernaut. Clash of Empires. Assyria versus Kushite Egypt. The triumph of the Kushite pharaohs would not go unchallenged. Far to the northeast, the Assyrian Empire had been steadily expanding, and by the 7th century BCE, it set its sights on Egypt. The resulting conflict would test Kushite rule to the breaking point. The rise of Assyria created an ironic role reversal. Egypt, long the aggressor, now faced invasion from a foreign superpower, and the Kushite dynasty suddenly became Egypt's defenders. Taharqa initially tried to diplomatically manage Assyria's threat, even maintaining correspondence with Assyrian kings, but eventually war became unavoidable. In 671 BCE, King Esarhaddon of Assyria marched his armies into the Nile Valley. Taharqa mobilized Egypt's defenses, but the Assyrian war machine was relentless. Esarhaddon captured Memphis, Egypt's northern capital, and according to Assyrian records, took immense loot and many captives, perhaps even some of Taharqa's family. Pharaoh Taharqa was forced to flee south. Assyria proclaimed victory and installed native vassals in the delta. But the Kushite ruler was not finished yet. Taharqa retreated to Nubia, regrouped, and struck back as soon as the Assyrian army left. Like a true descendant of the resilient Kushite spirit, he reasserted control over Thebes and much of Egypt for a brief time. Hearing this, Esarhaddon prepared a second invasion, but fate intervened. Esarhaddon died in 669 BCE before he could return. Taharqa too fell ill and died around 664 BCE, after a reign of around 26 years. His death would set the stage for the final act of the Kushite-Assyrian War. Taharqa's successor was his nephew Tantamani, also called Tanutamani. No sooner had Tantamani taken up the double crown than Assyria's new king, Ashurbanipal, launched a fresh onslaught. The Assyrians were determined to finish what Esarhaddon started. Tantamani fought fiercely and even scored a victory near Thebes initially, but he could not withstand the full might of Assyria's forces. Ashurbanipal's army pushed all the way to Thebes. In 663 BCE, Thebes, Egypt's holiest city, was brutally sacked by the Assyrians, an event that sent shockwaves through the ancient world. With this, the 25th dynasty's rule in Egypt was effectively ended. Ashurbanipal set up a client king in Saz, the Delta, Necho, who was loyal to Assyria. Necho's son Psamtik would later found Egypt's 26th dynasty. After rebelling from Assyrian oversight, Pharaoh Tantamani retreated to Nubia after his defeat. He may have held on to a flicker of hope of reconquering Egypt. Indeed, he left a stela recounting a dream in which the gods promised he would reclaim the north, reflecting his lingering ambitions. But in reality, by the late 660s BCE, the Kushite armies had withdrawn for good beyond the First Cataract. Egypt, devastated and humbled, returned to native rule in the north, while the Kushite kings remained sovereign in their southern domain. The era of Kushite dominance over Egypt was over, but the kingdom of Kush itself lived on, and in Nubia it continued to flourish for many centuries more. The kingdom of Kush after Egypt. A legacy at Nuri. With their expulsion from Egypt, the Kushite rulers refocused on their own land along the Middle Nile. Napata remained the religious and royal center for a time, and the kings of Kush continued to emulate pharaonic traditions, even as they adapted to changing times. One of the most remarkable legacies of the 25th dynasty's influence is found at the royal cemetery of Nuri in Nubia. Here, in the desert north of Khartoum, stands a field of pyramids, monuments to the Kushite pharaohs and their families. These pyramids, though smaller in scale than the great pyramids of Giza, are steeply angled and elegant, each atop an underground tomb chamber. They are physical testaments to how deeply Egyptian culture took root in Kush, and how the Kushites made it their own. At Nuri, we see the fusion of Egyptian and Nubian funeral traditions on full display. This necropolis was likely initiated by the great Taharqa himself, around 664 BCE. His pyramid at Nuri is the largest and oldest on the site. Over 80 royal burials have been identified at Nuri, spanning 4 centuries of Kushite history. After Taharqa, generations of kings and queens of Kush chose to be interred here, each pyramid a new addition to the skyline. Crucially, these burials adapted aspects of Egyptian mortuary practice into distinctly Nubian forms. The tomb builders at Nuri carved underground burial chambers and decorated them with familiar Egyptian symbols, images of gods like Osiris and Isis, hieroglyphic prayers from the Book of the Dead, but often executed with local artistic flair. Paintings in one Nuri queen's tomb show her wearing an Egyptian-style crown and worshipping Osiris. Yet the art style and even pigments used, including a unique Nubian green pigment, differ subtly from those in Egyptian tombs. Pottery, jewelry, and sarcophagi from Nuri likewise blend the two cultures. Archaeologists have found Egyptian-formed vessels with Nubian decorations and inscribed stone slabs, stele, in Egyptian language alongside Nubian-style royal adornments. The Pyramid of Taharqa at Nuri, rising about 50 feet tall, exemplified Kush's royal confidence. Although partly ruined today, it once towered as a massive symbol that Kushite kings were true pharaohs in their own right. Nearby are the pyramids of later kings like Tunwetamani's successors, Atlanersa, Senkamanaskan, and Lamani, Aspelta, and more, each with its own story. Notably, Aspelta, ruling c. 600 to 580 BCE, was buried at Nuri with an elaborate tomb that modern underwater archaeologists have begun exploring. Because groundwater has flooded many tombs, Aspelta's tomb chamber, still sealed in antiquity, contained a massive granite sarcophagus and likely many treasures, waiting to be studied as pumps drained the waters. Such explorations underscore the archaeological significance of Nuri. It is a site that can still yield new information about Kush's golden age. In fact, Nuri was largely neglected by scholars for decades after its initial excavation in 1916-18. Due to earlier bias that downplayed Kushite accomplishments, only recently have expeditions returned, literally diving into submerged vaults to document and preserve this heritage. Nuri also provides insight into the ongoing Egypto-Kushite connections after the 25th dynasty. Some Kushite royals buried here had family ties to Egypt or likely married Egyptians. For instance, one queen's title inscribed in her Nuri tomb is Woman of Egypt, implying she was of Egyptian origin. This suggests marriage alliances that continued between the Kushite court and the ruling families of Egypt's later dynasties. Even in death, the interplay of politics and culture between the two civilizations endured. The very choice of pyramid burials is telling. Long after Egyptians had stopped building pyramids, the last Egyptian pyramids were built over 1,000 years earlier in the New Kingdom. The Kushite kings revived the form. To them, these small pyramids were potent symbols of legitimacy and continuity with the deep past. At the same time, their unique style and local materials made them distinctly Nubian. Nuri's archaeological riches thus encapsulate the hybrid world of Kush, devoutly preserving ancient Egyptian traditions while innovating upon them to suit a Nubian royal identity. Changing fortunes, Egypt and Kush in the later years. As centuries passed, the balance of power between Egypt and Kush shifted again. After the Kushite 25th dynasty, Egypt entered its late period. The 26th dynasty, Saite period, ruled from the delta city of Sais and tried to revive Egypt's former glory. These Saite pharaohs, however, did not forget the southern threat. In 592 BCE, an Egyptian army under Pharaoh Psamtik II marched deep into Nubia. Psamtik II sought to punish Kush for its past dominion and perhaps to preempt any future reconquest of Egypt. His forces struck at Napata, the old Kushite capital. The attack was devastating. Egyptian troops burned Napata to the ground and plundered its temples and palaces. Statues of the Nubian kings were smashed or carried off to Egypt as war trophies. Archaeologists have found pieces of these in Sudan, buried for safekeeping by Kushite priests during the attack. King Aspelta of Kush survived the onslaught, but learned a harsh lesson. Napata, so close to the Egyptian frontier, was vulnerable. In the wake of this defeat, Aspelta made a fateful decision. He moved the royal capital further south to Meru, far beyond the reach of Egyptian armies. Thus began the Meroitic period of the Kushite kingdom. Meru, located between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, was more remote and better sheltered from northern invaders. Surrounded by savanna and near iron-rich highlands, Meru offered new opportunities. Over time, after about 300 BCE, the culture of Kush became increasingly distinct. The kings eventually adopted a new local writing script, Meroitic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs fell out of use. The art and religion of Meru, while still echoing Egyptian roots, showed more African character. Indigenous gods like the lion-headed Apedmek rose in prominence alongside Amun. The pyramids at Mero's royal cemeteries continued the tradition seen at Nuri, though in even greater numbers. Meru boasts dozens upon dozens of steep pyramids, giving Sudan the distinction of having more pyramids than Egypt. Back in the north, Egypt's independence did not last long. In 525 BCE, the Achaemenid Persians under Cambyses II conquered Egypt, folding it into a far larger empire. Cambyses reportedly attempted to invade Kush as well, but according to Greek historians, that expedition failed in the desert, a humbling check on Persian ambitions. Kush and Egypt now found themselves under very different trajectories. Kush remained a sovereign kingdom, now based at Meru, while Egypt passed from one foreign overlord to another. After the Persians came Alexander the Great, conquering Egypt in 332 BCE. Then the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, 300-530 BCE. And finally Rome. It was ironically at the moment of Egypt's final loss of native rule, when Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen, was defeated and Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BCE, that Kush and Egypt had one last fiery encounter. The new Roman rulers in Alexandria imposed heavy taxes and claimed dominion down to the First Cataract. Encroaching on what Kush considered its northern border, the ruling Kandake, Queen of Kush at that time, traditionally identified as Queen Amanirenas, refused to submit. Around 25 to 24 BCE, Kushite forces struck first. They attacked the Egyptian garrisons at Elephantine in Syene, Aswan, the frontier towns. Catching the Romans off guard, the Nubian archers and warriors even took trophies. Famously, a bronze head of Emperor Augustus was captured and later buried under the steps of a Kushite temple, so that people would symbolically trample the Roman emperor each time they entered. Rome retaliated swiftly. The Roman governor Petronius led legions south in 23 BCE, pushing beyond the First Cataract. He invaded deep into Kushite territory and targeted Napata, still a sacred city, though no longer the political capital. Napata was seized and razed to the ground, its inhabitants enslaved. This was one of the very few times in antiquity that a foreign army devastated the Kushite heartland in such a manner, a sobering echo of Psamtik's raid decades earlier. But the fierce Kandake Amanirenas did not concede. She regrouped and continued the fight. Ultimately, neither side was interested in a prolonged war in the desert. By about 20 BCE, Kush and Rome negotiated a peace treaty. The terms were remarkably favorable to Kush. The Romans withdrew from Napata and even abandoned claims to the southernmost territories, the Dodekaskoinos region, just south of Aswan. A boundary was set at roughly the First Cataract, and Kush was exempted from paying tribute to Rome. This peace endured for centuries. Against the greatest empire of the time, Kush had asserted itself and secured respect. In contrast, Egypt would remain a captive province of foreign empires for the rest of antiquity. Every rise must have a fall. Egypt's ancient line of native pharaohs had ended with the 25th and 26th dynasty struggles. Thereafter, the land of the Nile was ruled by Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The Egyptian civilization continued in many forms under these empires, but the glory of the independent new kingdom, or even the Saite kings, was never to return. The temples and sphinx of Egypt stood as aging witnesses to a proud history now subsumed within larger realms. Kush, on the other hand, continued as one of the longest-lasting kingdoms in the ancient world. The Meroitic kingdom thrived for a few more centuries after the clash with Rome. Its queens and kings, the Kandakes and Kor, maintained a flourishing economy based on agriculture, iron smelting, and trade in ivory, gold, and exotic African goods. Roman historians marveled at the Ethiopians, their term for Kushites, who had defeated Roman troops, a rare feat. However, over time, Kush too began to wane. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, signs of decline mounted. The royal tombs at Meru became smaller and then ceased. Inscriptions grew scarce. The sands of the Sudan encroached on once fertile lands, and trade routes shifted to favor the rising Red Sea ports and the Aksumite Empire in Ethiopia. The end of Kush is still a subject of research and some mystery. One popular theory holds that Aksum, a powerful kingdom in what is now Ethiopia Eritrea, conquered Meru around 350 CE. King Ezana of Aksum left inscriptions claiming victory over the Kushites. Whether by foreign conquest or internal collapse, the kingdom of Kush faded by the late 4th century CE. The pyramids of Meru were abandoned to the desert. The Meroitic script fell out of use and remains only partly deciphered today. And Nubia eventually transitioned into new eras of smaller kingdoms and later Christianization. Thus, after an astonishing run of perhaps 2,000 years, from the time of Kerma through Napata and Meru, the Kushite civilization passed into history. Egypt, of course, went on under Roman and then Byzantine rule until the new force, Islam, arrived in the 7th century CE, bringing another cultural transformation. But in a sense, both ancient Egypt and ancient Kush ended as all great civilizations do, gradually, under the weight of time and change. Seen, twilight over the Nile Valley, the silhouettes of pyramids, some broad and familiar in Giza, others steep and clustered in Nubia, darken against the orange sky. The tale of Egypt and Kush is one of ebb and flow, dominance and defiance. Egypt, the northern giant, and Kush, its southern counterpart, were like two mighty trees whose roots were entwined. Each grew in the nourishing light of the Nile, sometimes overshadowing one another. They traded gifts and blows in equal measure. Egyptian pharaohs once marched in triumph through Nubia, only to have Nubian kings later don the double crown of Egypt and reign from Memphis. They shared gods, blood, and history, from the bowmen of Tasseti to the black pharaohs who restored a kingdom, from Pharaoh Taharka's stand against Assyria to Queen Amanarina's treaty with Rome. Today, the legacies of these interactions lie silent in the desert, crumbling temple walls with both Egyptian and Nubian hieroglyphs, sculptures and sphinx with distinctly African features, and pyramids large and small marking the tombs of long-gone kings. At Nuri, the burial ground of the Kushite pharaohs, archaeologists continue to unearth evidence of a time when Kush and Egypt were one. Shabby figurines, royal jewelry, and painted chambers that speak to a fusion of cultures. These findings, once dismissed by early scholars, now remind the world that the story of civilization along the Nile is richer and more intertwined than was long assumed. In recounting the rise and fall of the Kushites and Egyptians, we see more than just warfare and dates. We see a profound interaction of peoples, the political chess match for dominance, the cultural cross-pollination, the economic interdependence over gold and grain. we see how two distinct societies can shape one another's destinies in profound ways. Egypt's grandeur pushed Nubia to new heights. Nubia's resurgence gave Egypt a final flash of glory. And in the end, each left an indelible mark on the other. The pharaohs of Egypt could never forget the land of the bow, and the kings of Kush never ceased to honor the legacy of the pharaohs. As the camera pans over the ruins of Meru and the columns of Luxor, we're reminded that history is a continuum. The rise and fall of these kingdoms did not happen in isolation, but in a constant flow, like the Nile itself, sometimes flooding, sometimes receding, always bringing change. The story of Kush and Egypt, of conquest and cooperation, stands as a testament to the dynamism of the ancient world. And though both kingdoms have long fallen, their story endures in stone and memory, waiting for each new generation to discover and marvel at the saga of two lands entwined by the Nile. Sources, ancient texts, archaeological reports, and modern research have all informed this script. Key archaeological insights on Kushite burials at Nuri, historical records like Pi's Victory Stela, Assyrian annals, and classical writings have been cited throughout to ensure historical accuracy. The story of the rise and fall of Kush and Egypt lives on through these records, allowing us to retell this epic saga of two great African civilizations.